Alright, so hello again, Rebel Scum. Uh, we're discussing the Codex. This is going to be the second video. Uh, if you tuned in last time, you know that I'm discussing basically the way that the book of the Bible was written. The Old Testament canon, the New Testament canon, the Codex of what eventually became the Bible, all these things. And so I want to talk about something that is a big part of this, and part of the arguments has to do with the age of the Bible, the translations. A lot of people really knock the Bible because there are no original copies. Now, obviously, the codexes are original copies. These are when the letters were gathered together. Now, these codexes did not come into existence, until about anywhere from 150 years to about 300 years after the events of the Bible took place. So that's when they started to gather all the letters together, because until then all they had done was just copy the letters and pass them around to the various congregations, or they relied on oral storytellers to memorize and tell the stories much like they used to with the ancient rabbis. So again, people are very much like, well, there's no original copy of these letters. So let's forget the codex and deal with the letters. Now, I've already stated that one of the oldest letters that we have is a Book of John that is 70 years after the writing of the original Book of John, when basically the letter was originally penned by John and sent. It was basically sent to that location. People really liked it, and they copied it, and many copies were made. And the closest copy we have in terms of date is 70 years after. Now, people are a little bit upset about them. They're like, well, it should be the original. And that's a very hard thing to do because papyrus didn't exactly last long. In order to keep papyrus from falling apart, you would have to take the papyrus, wrap it in beeswax. You would actually encase the letter in beeswax and wrap it with twine. And this is how basically the libraries first got started, making sure that these letters would not fall apart. It's kind of a crazy way of doing it, but we actually, if you've ever heard people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I will make another video about because people think a lot of crazy stuff about the Dead Sea Scrolls that also isn't true. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were papyrus, and they were stored in this manner, using a beeswax. And it's really kind of cool. So maybe I'll even do a demo of it where I'll actually get some beeswax and some papyrus, to show exactly how it would look. I think it's kind of a cool technique. Anyway, so when we're talking about these ancient books of the Bible, people again are upset we don't have the originals. Now, obviously, I don't think we really care about the originals of the Old Testament. We've got, 3,000-year-old copies of it to, copies that are 200 years. And the level of meticulous keeping of those scriptures is insane. Nobody really doubts that the Old Testament has been maintained to the truest form throughout history. It's crazy. No other book in the entire world has really been maintained to that level of scrutiny. It's amazing. It really is. But then when we get to the New Testament, people have arguments all the time over, the level of scrutiny that those were maintained at. And that's really what sets up the arguments, is trying to get the best Bible to the closest translation. And people argue this all the time, but the basis of that stems eventually from the Codex. So the thing is that what if we compared any other book in the history of the world to the Bible? If we're going to argue that a copy needs to be exact, and not only exact, but it has to be the original, otherwise we aren't going to believe it exists, we're talking about the works of Plato. There are no original works of Plato left. Caesar's Gallic Wars. There are no original copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars. You go through and there are really no copies of these things. These are very, very important historical documents that have affected your education of the ancient world. Now, so that's within the exact. Now, within 100 years, it keeps on going from there. There are, tons of letters that we still use in our education and in the basis of our world history and sociology that no copy exists within 100 years. Within 1,000 years, there are texts that we cannot verify that they are, that they existed at all, except for copies that are 1,000 years later. Let's see, there is, let's just go down a list here. When it comes to about 1,000 years, there's Thucydides, I believe is how it's said. His history, the closest one that we have is 1,300 years after it was originally penned. There was Plato, I mentioned earlier. Plato also, his earliest copies that we have of his works is 1,300 years later. Caesar's Gallic Wars, 1,000 years later. Tacitus's Annals, Pliny's Letters, Suetonius's Lives, Herodotus' History, all those, we don't even have any of these books. And these, again, are books that we rely on heavily to understand the past. We don't have any copies of those books within a 500-year period of when they were first written. And that's just because of how the paper was stored, how the paper would have been maintained, all this. And so there is a huge amount of scrutiny placed on the Bible and placed on the letters thereof that you will not find placed on any other document. Religious documents. Why is it that we do not really talk about the ancient codexes or the scrutiny of other religions and their documents? It's really Christianity that is really, targeted by this kind of, dualistic thinking. Where, yeah, we'll accept everything else and, we'll accept anything else historically. But because the Bible is a religion and because so many people believe it, we're going to be very scrutinous about it. And if there is not an original copy, we aren't going to believe it. And that's kind of ridiculous. So, let's go ahead and I'll start up the next video here in a moment and we'll discuss the various codexes. Now I'm going to discuss them from a very specific point of view. I'm going to discuss them from the theologian, historian point of view. I'm not going to discuss it so much from the religious point of views. I'm not going to go for any of the, one version is better than another version. If you believe that, you can make those arguments when you talk with people firsthand. I'm going to present historical facts here and discuss those basically history, who wrote it, where they're stored, do we still have them, that sort of thing. Where they traveled from, because there's some interesting things that have happened to the Bible throughout the years. Anyway, we're going to start off with the ancient codexes next.